Hi, I'm Sam Coffman with The Human Path, thehumanpath.com, and today I would like to talk about first aid kits, specifically herbal first aid kits. I'll use the herbal first aid kit that we make and that we sell at The Human Path as a sort of a baseline, not because I want this to be an infomercial for our first aid kit, but because it's a good baseline because we have a trauma kit, we have the herbs a lot of herbs, but as you'll see as we talk about it, not enough. There never is enough. You're always missing herbs when you get to a remote or to an area where you need to use the herbs. There's always something that you should have brought that you didn't. So I try to cover as wide a spectrum as I can with the herbs, kind of the baseline pack first aid kit. And we'll start from there as a good baseline. And I'll talk about my own experiences using my own herbal first aid kits. My experience goes back again about 25 years to being a Green Beret medic, and at the same time being really interested in herbs, and over the last 25 years trying to meld those two worlds really as well as I can, and my niche kind of being first aid, trauma, wilderness first aid, and all the things that you would normally go to an ER for. I'm really into that, and of course remote and post-disaster medicine. This is where a first aid kit really comes in handy. Real quickly, I know some people might ask themselves, well, why would you want an herbal first aid kit versus just a regular first aid kit? And there's several reasons. First of all, because herbs work, and they work very well. They're available, they're cheap, they're something that really just takes knowledge. It just takes you learning about the herb in order to be able to use it. The rest is either growing it or wildcrafting it or even buying it. But even if you buy it, from a reputable place or places ethically wildcrafted or whatever, they're usually still very inexpensive, and even for herbs that are overbought and that you shouldn't buy, there are always good substitutes for certain things. So first of all, herbs are very available. They are the people's medicine. They always have been, and they always will be, regardless of what happens with the legal drug cartel, as I call it, which is the pharmaceutical company and the FDA and the AMA, kind of in their own little world. That, regardless of what medicinal herbs and plant medicine, always will be that type of that medicine that's for the people, that's for our human bodies, that we've co-evolved with for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. It works. The second reason is because I can't take pharmaceuticals with me. I'm not a doctor. I'm not even a PA. I'm certainly not a Special Forces medic anymore. I've been out for a long time. Even though our role in SF, in Special Forces, was a lot like a PA in a third world environment, I couldn't if I wanted to, and I don't want to. Third, because herbs are a very easy way to take care of a wide spectrum, a wide variety of problems, and it gives you a huge number of tools at your fingertips once you learn how to use them and learn even just a limited materia medica that you might have in a first aid kit. At least if you know how to use that, even if there's only, let's say, a dozen or even maybe 20 different formulas and simples, but you know how to use them very well, that gives you a really wide spectrum of things that you can use, of tools that you can use in an herbal first aid kind of environment, whether it's for acute injury or acute illness, or even for a chronic injury maybe, or a chronic illness even that's flaring back up or something like that. But most of the stuff that we do at the Human Path and Herbal Medics is focused towards remote medicine. So in other words, places where you have to hike in, or in Central America or South America or Mexico or wherever it is that we're going, or in post-disaster medicine. So in other words, a Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Sandy situation where there's no available what we would call higher or hospital type medicine or higher definitive care available, and so this is what we're using, and this is what we have to work with. That's where we're going with this, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and get behind the camera, and I'll go through the herbal first aid kit that we sell and that we have, and I'll have a link on here too in case you're interested in that. But again, this isn't meant to be an infomercial. It's just, this is a great baseline, and it is a great kit, and I'll explain how I got to the place of where the types of containers we use, the types of herbs, of course, that are in there, and even the trauma kit, and all the different the pros and cons of any good kit. And every kit has pros and cons. So that's where we're going next. I apologize for the dogs barking. That's the neighbor's dogs. It's not my dogs. My dogs would not do that. They're very well trained. Believe me, they are. And they're out here too, but they're just chilling. And that noise is hopefully not going to be a big problem with this video. I hope not. So I'll get back on the camera next and explain from behind the camera a little bit about our first aid kit. So I think a really good place to start when you're talking about any kind of a first aid kit, certainly an herbal first aid kit, is the subject of containers. So I want to talk about containers here, and that starts literally from the backpack all the way down to whatever we're using to contain herbs, and even the bags that we use, or any kind of plastic we're using for waterproofing, for things like gauze, 4x4s or 2x2s or bandages or band-aids, that type of thing. All of that stuff. So I'm going to go through, and I'm going to be pretty brief, but I want to talk about the actual pack. Start with the pack and move down into that, and talk about just the containers alone, and then we'll go back around and talk about, of course, what's in them. So first of all, pack. When you were talking about a first aid kit, in my opinion, you always want to talk about something you can either put on your back, or if it's something small that you can fit into a cargo pocket, in your pants or whatever. But it needs to be transportable in some way other than carrying it in your hands, or even uncomfortably, putting it on a satchel type thing over one shoulder. You really need to be able to put it on your back comfortably, or be able to put it into a larger pack or a larger type of container. That's important as well. So, what is the perfect pack? Well, this is like when people ask me, what's the perfect survival knife? Well, it depends on what you need. It depends on what you're doing. Or what's the perfect gun? Well, are you hunting elk, or are you trying to defend your home? So what's the perfect first aid pack? Depends, of course, a lot on your mission and what you're planning on doing with it. And you might have one in the car, you might have one in the house, you might have one at at work or whatever. You might have different first aid kits with different things that you're thinking about. When we've gone down in the past to for instance, this last year to Nicaragua versus the year before, I had two totally different missions. So I had two different first aid kits, types of first aid kits, and the types of herbs I took and everything were different as well. So you find you have to try to balance that, and just bear in mind, no matter what you think that you've got, in terms of your kit and what you're taking, no matter what you're using, you're always going to leave something out. You're always going to get there and use it and say, oh man, I wish I had this, or I wish I had that. So that's just kind of how it works. Now, I've gone for literally years, decades, well over 20 years. I've worked with nothing but first aid kits that I could carry on my back, or put into a larger pack on my back. Like when I was in Special Forces, the med kit would fit at the top of my rucksack, basically. So that idea is something that I've been thinking. I think about all the time, and so I've gone through dozens, if maybe even over 100 packs. Literally, that sounds like a lot, but it really, over the period of years, I'm always testing out new types of packs and new stuff. And I'm not trying to find expensive stuff. I just pick up stuff where it's like, oh yeah, this is good. Some of the best packs I've found have been under 30 or 40 bucks. Literally. So the one that I'm talking about, that I'm using here, that you're looking at a picture of now, is what I've kind of landed at in the last year or so, or year and a half. And I like it. I really like it. It's small enough that I can fit it actually. It's not that small, but I can fit it into a larger pack if I need to. And here's a picture of me, or a picture of the pack at the top of my bigger pack. And I don't usually take that much stuff with me, but it depends on where we're going. And so I can either put it on my back, and it works well that way, or I can put it here, and I can even, it's big enough that I could fit in some basic survival gear if I needed to, a small hammock, or in a small survival kit, that kind of thing, something just to be able to camp or to backpack if I needed to. So I could actually even fit that stuff in here. So it's got straps on the side, as you can see. It's got the MOLLE attachments on the outside, so you could actually put other packs on the outside too. So I like all of that. And it's got a waist. I think it's important that it have a waistband, and that it be, that you can tighten down the shoulders real good. And so this whole thing it's good. I would give it. I've never had any pack that I could say is A+ all the way across the board, but I would say this is definitely if I had to give it a grade, it's in the 90% range. So it's a low A. Let's put it that way. Now, the next thing that's important, very important about first aid, herbal first aid, and especially about just basic first aid and trauma, is that you are able to open up everything and lay it flat. It's very important that if you have somebody who's just been shot by let's say a gunshot wound to the chest, or they cut themselves really deeply, or got cut, fell, whatever, and they've got an arterial bleed, or even just a really bad venous bleed, it's very important that you're not digging through things vertically in your pack to try to find, and there's blood everywhere, and your hands are slippery, and it's night, and you're trying to put your headlamp on, and you're trying to dig down vertically through your pack to be able to find what you need to stop the bleeding. You don't want that. You want to be able to pull stuff out and just lay it flat. And so what I have ended up with, what I really like, as you can see in the pictures here, is this is just a standard travel, what would you call, like a travel kit, you know, that you can buy. And I've been through, again, I've been through dozens of these kinds of different ideas of buying these and trying them out. This is the best one I've found yet, and it's got the webbing on the top, so you can hang it from a tree, or you can lay it out flat, or you can clip it, unclip it. You can open everything up. You can see what's there. It's even got a little bit of water. You know, it's fairly water resistant. You could put the whole thing in plastic if you needed to, although that's one more layer you got to rip through, you know, in an emergency. But still, it's, you know, there's a lot of things you can do with this, and so this fits very well, very snugly into either of the first two compartments of this overall pack. So that's what I use for the trauma side of things, and so between the pack and all the things it carries, and the fact that you can actually, the big pack, you can actually open it up and it lays down fairly flat as well. It's got some webbing on there that you got to loosen up to really do it, but you could if you needed to. Now, it's not ideal. There are some packs where you can just open them up and they lay flat out all the way, and that's great. But in terms of an herbal first aid kit, you know, really, I mean, realistically, you know, how many times are you going to be like, in an emergency, you got to grab I've got to get my chaparral tincture, man. I got to get it. I've got like less than 10 seconds to get it. I mean, that's never going to happen, probably. You might be using some poultice, wound powder, and having to do that really quickly to help. I have some really good wound powder that helps clot bleeding and helps tissue proliferation and fight infection, and that's good. But I'd stop the bleeding first anyway, and then go back around probably. If it was really bad bleeding, I wouldn't be worrying about wound powder. I would probably just stop the bleeding first. So my point is, whether or not your tinctures are all lying out there in you know, perfect order, and you can open them up and they're all flat, that's great, and that's very convenient. It's great if you can do that. But if you can't, it's not the end of the world if you got to dig a little bit vertically, or have your tinctures in separate bottles, separate containers, you know, separate types of bags, you know, as well. So now you don't want it to be totally ridiculous to where you've got like 30 or 40 bottles that you're trying to dig through in one bag. But, you know, if you got 10 or even a dozen bottles in a bag, that's, you know, you can certainly work with that. And you've got time, is my point. So the whole laying out flat thing that I was talking about is really, that's specifically for trauma, that you really need that. It's very crucial. And so that's how this bag is designed. All three of the bags that we're using here for both for herbs, for the trauma kit, and for the overall bag, you know, fit nicely within each other, which is why I've gone this route. And there's some other stuff we can do here. We can get some Velcro, and we can kind of customize and make some other ways of carrying. You know, in netting, I like netting a lot because then you can see, so it's a good way to carry herb and herb bottles as well, because you can see the labels through the netting. So we could do something like that. Now, bear in mind that this particular pack that I'm showing you, actually has a number of different netted pockets as well. So there are tons of room to be able to put tinctures in there as well. But aside from the actual tincture bag that it comes with, is just the baseline pack too. Let's move on to the actual containers themselves. Well, true to form, here we are almost 15 minutes into the video, and I still haven't really gotten into the herbs yet, but bear with me, please. Of course, since this is a video, you can always fast forward it if you want to get into that anyway. But I want to talk still about the containers we use to hold the tinctures, the salves, the liniments, the wound powders, the burn powder, you know, the powders, because it's very important, and it's really overlooked. There's very few, I don't know any herbalists really that actually focus or spend any time on this, and they should. So here's the deal. Glass is not going to work for your field first aid kit. It doesn't matter if you're in an urban area. It doesn't matter if you're in the wilderness. It doesn't matter post-disaster, in your car and you get in a car wreck, or, you know, something happens. Wherever you are, glass is heavy, it breaks, and more importantly, those stupid little rubber droppers, you know, the dropper tops, they degrade really quickly. They get dirty. Those things are just, they're not very hygienic. And in the UV, they degrade. That rubber degrades very quickly, and it just wears out. Just using it a lot, it wears out. So what I far prefer is just narrow mouth Nalgene bottles. And you could use wide mouth as well, because they make leak proof, but narrow mouth is much easier to pour, and then it's much easier to measure, as I'll talk about in just a second. So the Nalgene I'm talking about is a high density propylene, HDPE plastic that you can get online. My favorite place to do that is Freund Containers. It's Freund containers, like friend in German. Freundcontainers.com, I think, is their site. And they're kind of expensive. They are actually quite expensive. They come out to being damn near as much as the glass containers are, but nonetheless, they are well worth it. You can keep your herbs in there. You can keep your tinctures in these things for, I've kept them in there for years. Literally, as long as I've kept in glass, I've kept in Nalgene, just for the purpose of testing that. I've probably used them for about 3 years. I mean, I've used Nalgene for about 3 years. But I tell you, I've had a lot of trial and error before that. I've probably messed around with field first aid kits for herbs for over 10 years now. And Nalgene is what I've landed on. I've used it very happily for the last 3 years. I take them to Central America, to out of the country. And in the country, I've probably flown with the Nalgene bottles dozens of times, or at least somewhere between a dozen and 40 times, something like that. Never have had a problem with a leak, whether they're checked and non-pressurized, or whether I'm taking them as carry-on. I've never had a problem. So these are very leak-proof. They're very solid. They don't wear out. Now I keep them, of course, out of the sun and out of the heat as much as I can, but even with being a field first aid kit and getting banged around and getting used like that, they're very durable. In fact, the only thing I've ever seen wear these things out is one of my dogs that likes to chew on them if I'm not careful. She's still kind of a pup and has a tendency to do that. But other than that, I've never seen, they're great. They last, they're very durable. And so this is what I recommend highly using in tinctures. So the sizes of these things are 1 ounce, 2 ounce, 4 ounce, 8 ounce, and 16 ounce and 32 ounce. Now 32 ounce is just way too, is not really very usable for traveling with. 16 ounces is about as large as you want to go if you're taking these on the road somewhere. If you, for instance, if you're going to set up a clinic somewhere, an herbal clinic in Mexico or something like that, and you need to take down a bunch of herbs with you, I would highly recommend using 16 ounce. It's much less unwieldy than 32 ounce is. And then from there, you can mix. You just take all your simples down, and then you can mix and make your formulas in your clinic that way. And then I use the 1 ounce for what I actually hand out to clients or to anybody in a clinic that they're taking home something. We use 1 ounce for that. So for us, for this talk, for this video, what I'm talking about is your own personal herbal first aid kit, and for that I would highly recommend 2 ounce. Nothing smaller than 2 ounce, and really bigger than 2 ounce for just basic tinctures is not necessarily it's more than you're going to probably need for a personal first aid kit. So that's what I use. Now, how do we measure and how do we know if we don't have a dropper? It's like people kind of freak out. A lot of herbalists are like they can't live without that dropper measurement with their tinctures. Well, you just use a capful and measure it. So a capful is about 5 milliliters. 5 milliliters is about the equivalent of 4 to 5 what you can get in 4 to 5 dropper squeezes. Now, when you do a dropper full, it's really not a dropper full, as I'm sure you know. You squeeze and you fill up the dropper, and it's really about half a dropper full. And that's that's somewhere in the range of 1, maybe a little bit more than 1 milliliter. So I just do it that way. It's like if I were going to tell somebody to take 2 to 3 dropperfuls, a couple times a day of some sort of a formula, then I just tell them it's a capful. You just take half a capful, 2 to 3 times a day. Because there you go. So that's the easiest way to deal with it, is just a capful, and it's very easy to pour from the narrow mouth out into that lid, and then they can use that lid as sort of a shot glass, or they can just dump it straight into a drink or whatever and drink it that way. That's what I have to say about the tincture bottles. Liniment also you can put in these, but liniment you can be a little bit more, and especially if it's a liniment or an oil, you can be a little bit more flexible in terms of what you use for that. It doesn't have to be the Nalgene. Salves, I generally put in the hard plastic. I'll have pictures of this, the hard plastic salve jars. And then powders, you can either go in the hard plastic, or I kind of actually prefer the HDPE plastic that I use for tooth sticks. So again, it's a high density propylene, and it's the tooth sticks and the tooth powder that I use. It's just the lid tightens down a lot tighter, and sometimes with salve, those rounded salve jars that are the hard plastic, even though I like that hard plastic, those lids don't really tighten down and stay tight like they need to. So I prefer the tooth stick jar for that. Getting into, I think that covers everything to do with containers that I need to. So let's talk about the herbs next. All right, so now that I'm finally here ready to talk about all the herbs in the Herbal First Aid Kit, I'm looking at the time, and I think I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to have to end this video. I'm just kidding. No worries. Let's talk about herbs, and let's talk about, beyond that, also the actual herbal first aid contents. I'll have all this posted up here as I'm talking here. But let's talk about the herbs first. Herbs in a first aid kit, that is such a huge topic and idea to think about, but I'll give you the ones that I have. I have about 12 different tinctures for the base first aid kit that we sell, and that I consider just sort of the base, just the same as the trauma kit and all the stuff that's on the first aid side of this kit that we'll talk about briefly as well. It's the starting point. It's by no means a complete herbal first aid kit, and yet at the same time, it's something that you can pick up and put on your back and go, and it covers a wide spectrum of issues that you might run into, especially in the field. And that's mainly my biggest concern, is that it's something that's usable in the field or in an urban environment post-disaster, or just basic unexpected medical emergency type stuff. Now, I will also put a list out of some of the stuff that I've taken down for clinics and other places so that you can see. It's a much more extensive list, obviously, a lot more herbs going on in there. But this is what I like. This is what I've kind of narrowed it down to, is the things that I seem to use the most. So the 12, I think I've got a dozen total tinctures, and those range from a couple of simples, which are algareeta and chaparral. So chaparral and algareeta both are two herbs that I could talk literally for a couple of hours about. I mean, there's so much that there's a reason why I use these as simples a lot. I'm not going to get into that here just because there's no time. But I do have, with the Herbal First Aid Kit, if you purchase one of these, if you're interested in that, then just to let you know, there is a field manual that comes along with it that explains the basic uses of all of these herbs, to include those two simples. And then I've got some formulas in here. The lymph formula that I use is very similar. It's very kind of a constant preventative type of formula that seems to work very well for people who are just starting to get sick or feel like they're just, they were maybe exposed to something. It's a really good preventative type formula. The cold and flu can be given before as well, and in case you're worried about the fact that I'm saying that echinacea is going to cure the cold, like the ridiculous faddish kind of misinformation that's been thrown out there about echinacea over the last couple of decades. That's not at all what I'm saying, but echinacea certainly is good for a number of different acute onset of viral type presentations, especially things that can be remedied to some degree, or that help your body heal to some degree by the stimulation of white blood cell activity. So that's part of why I have it in there. Bone Set is also really good. It's a formula that I've had literally. I've had doctors come and tell me they got the flu. Particularly this flu season, which has been really bad for a lot of people. It's like a 5-day flu, and some people are hanging on to it for a couple of weeks. They're getting respiratory stuff on the back end of it, and they're still sick 3 weeks later. Anyway, I had a doctor this year tell me she just bought our Herbal First Aid Kit from me, and said, and she's kind of a skeptic too, and she emailed me and told me, man, I was only sick with the flu for 1 day. Let's see Tamiflu do that. And she, everybody around her was, falling like flies and sick and out for a week. And so she was pretty impressed with that. And, whether or not that, I'm not going to say that works the same for everybody. As we all know, herbs work differently for different people. But in general, it's a very effective formula. It works really well for me. I feel like UTI formula is really something that's important to have as a backup for different issues that present directly in terms of UTI, but also sometimes as a follow-up for other illnesses that you get that on the back end, on the tail end, end up turning into a mild UTI. Liver and gallbladder anti-congestion formula. This is a little bit more intense than the digestive aid and anti-nausea formula. It's a little bit more, we want to stimulate. It's more of a cholagogue. It's to stimulate the liver and even the pancreas to do their work in terms of digestion of food and digestion of proteins and fats, and also just to stimulate the liver slightly to do more of what it does. There's several different functions that the liver fulfills for us physiologically, and one of them is the digestion of fats and proteins. Another one is is of course the regulation of blood sugar, and then also cleaning the blood. So even in terms of those other some of those other main functions, it's a stimulation. The adrenal stress and anti-fatigue is kind of a general formula that is both an adaptogenic, but also is a lot of people who need an adaptogen tend to find that they feel fatigued, and a lot of times the best cure for fatigue that's related to adrenal undercompensation is exercise, but you can't always give that, and so this actually helps that fatigue on that side, and usually gives people more energy to feel like they want to exercise, to feel like they want to get out there and actually do something. It's also a little bit of a mental clarity. I call it a mental clarity type formula. It tends to help people with thinking, with problem solving and dealing with things when they are fatigued to some degree. The Bacopa is really good for that. Then I have a sort of an anti-worm or an anti-helminthic, an anti-protozoan formula. I have an analgesic, anti-inflammatory. Now, analgesic is such a broad term that there's so many different types of pain. This is by no means one of those that's going to take care of all different types of pain. There's certainly many types that it will not take care of at all. And honestly, in my first aid kit, I carry around aspirin and Motrin too, because there's just some people who are skeptical or just don't even want to deal with herbs. They have a bad headache. They want something that acts really fast. They don't want to deal with herbs. They just want to take something that'll get that headache away. So this is somewhat of an anti-inflammatory and also an anti the types of pain like headache type pain or from an injury type of pain that you might get, like somebody got injured in the backcountry and they're having a hard time dealing with that and calming down. The analgesic anti-inflammatory formula along with the nervine formula would help them help ease a lot of that pain and anxiety, help them sleep a little better, that type of thing. So the nervine formula happened to be next in the list, and so you can see that as well. Obviously, I'm giving you all the herbs in the common names of these herbs. I don't usually like working with common names, but because this is sort of this is more or less an intro type class, it's just an introduction. It's not even really a class, but just telling you about my first aid kits. And for people who are buying these first aid kits who don't really know these herbs, common names is a lot easier way to work with them. If you come to my herbology classes at the Human Path, we really pretty much only use scientific names because there's that way we really avoid any kind of confusion about what plants we're actually talking about and what we're working with. I have a broad spectrum anti-infective, and this is just sort of like everything. This is sort of a kitchen sink type of formula that's gram-positive, gram-negative bacteria. It's mostly for bacterial type infections, and both within the gut and outside of the gut. There's some herbs in here that won't really work outside the gut very well. Some that work really well for respiratory, some that work well for urinary. It's just it's kind of a broad spectrum antibacterial formula in general. Also a little bit of an immune stimulant as well. And then I have a digestive aid and anti-nausea formula that's really more of somebody's been they're having a hard time digesting food or maybe even mild gastritis. They're having maybe nausea, like even motion sickness or something of that sort, or just feeling maybe even a hangover. That type of nausea is good for as well. The bruise and sprain and inflammation is external use only. This is something to be able to put on a wound externally. It's got some very decent herbs in there to both help bruising heal, to help contusions heal quickly, more quickly, and also to a few counter irritants in there that help carry the herb in pretty well. Then I've got some salves, one that's more for like abrasions and just chafing, that type of thing that you see in the field a lot of times. And then one that's more for deep wound healing. Now, I don't use salves normally very much in terms of like if you get a really deep laceration, I would be much more inclined to use poultice on that. With the wound powder, I would never take salve and stick it in there, just because even if it's a really nice antimicrobial salve, they just tend to collect bacteria. They become bacteria traps in the field. And so, all that oil and the wax, everything, it just traps that stuff in. You can't really use it that way. But for the later healing stages of a wound, or if you're keeping it really clean and you're making sure that you got a bandage on top of it all the time that's nice and clean, after the initial, what I usually use these deep wound salve for is after the initial poultice has worked and done its thing for usually a couple of days, 48 hours or so maybe. Then as the skin's starting to heal, as the tissue's starting to heal, the deep wound salve is good to put on there and bandage really well on top. Just make sure you keep it really clean. Respiratory aid is more of an expectorant, both a stimulating and a relaxing, but I'm a firm believer in the amphoteric properties of herbs and their ability to, our body's ability rather, to know what it needs and use what it needs. Very similar to lobelia, which is both a relaxing and a stimulating expectorant. Right, isolamine and lobeline, are two of the constituents that are mapped out in that way. But there's many more constituents, of course, that are responsible for this. And so, this has a little bit of both of those worlds in it, and it works for people who need either. Generally, most people usually have an unproductive cough when you're actually working with them, because that's how most coughs start out, and this works very well that way as well. It's not really an antitussive necessarily, although it's got lots of alcohol in it, in a brandy and a honey base, and that usually helps the throat a little bit and helps with the cough as well, the cough reflex. Tooth sticks, that you can look at my other video if you aren't familiar with tooth care and tooth sticks and what that's all about. And then I have the two different powders, the poultice powders. And so if you don't know how to use poultice powders, then that's something I'll probably have a video on that soon enough. That's something, of course, you learn in any herb school. You certainly will learn it in ours. We're really big on poultices. And everything from herbs to charcoal, whatever, we're going to be using for either drawing infection out or dripping tissue proliferants and anti-inflammatory type herbs and healing and antimicrobial herbs into the wound. So one way or both ways, depending. And there's a lot that goes into that. There's a lot of, there's kind of a fine art of how to use poultices and how to not overuse them, at the same time not underuse them, and keep that tissue nice and healthy, keep the tissue state very healthy so that it can heal very quickly and heal without infection. Those are the herbal first aid preparations. Let me talk briefly about the trauma kit and what's in that. As you can see, it's mostly, I don't like using medical tape. Other than maybe, when I say medical tape, I mean the nylon, that's typical nylon medical tape. It's not really good. It's good for holding bandages down to skin, but tape is in the field and in a first aid kit needs to do a lot more than that. One thing I do actually use that first aid kit or the nylon medical tape for is labeling. Just to go back for a second, if you saw probably in the picture of my herbs in the case, in the actual container, you probably saw some little squares on the top on the lids. So all my herbs are obviously labeled, and I label all of my herbs with scientific names, or with a formula abbreviation. And so since I'm looking down from the top, it just makes it a little easier. I just go ahead and put those squares on the top of the caps, unless the herbs are going in the side pockets. But if they're in a pocket where I have to look straight down at them, that way I've got a little label on the lid as well. So it just makes it a little easier to pull them out, and I keep them usually alphabetical in both scientific name if they're simples or the formulas. And the formula, I just use an abbreviation that's F and then whatever the abbreviation is after that. So it's my own little system. I would suggest you do something like that too. At the same time, of course, realize that as a medic, when I was a medic in Special Forces, we had to cross-train with different other team jobs, team specialties, because there's different specialties on a team in Special Forces. And so one of the things that you have to do is you have to know, or everybody needs to know, where the medic keeps their kit and what's in the kit and where you keep the stuff in the kit. In case the medic gets hurt, other people know where to pull the medic kit out at and where things are at. So in that regard, just kind of taking that as an analogy to this, if you have all of your bottles labeled with scientific names, it might not be much a help for somebody that wants to give you the herbs if they don't understand and they don't know the scientific names. But in my opinion, that's not really, that's a moot point, because herbs are not, again, we're not using them for any kind of immediate trauma other than maybe the wound cure powder, or maybe, some things that we might give for shock, for initial shock, and I don't have, like for instance, anemone or even the rescue remedy or something like that you might have, whatever you like to use for that, and you would add into this base kit. Aside from those, you really, you're going to have time, and you're going to actually have to think, before you would give herbs to somebody anyway, and it isn't going to be somebody else. So I mean, if you had to kind of prescribe yourself or medicate yourself with somebody, to tell them, go to my first aid kit and get this or this or this out, because it's not going to be something where they're going to be able to help you while you're unconscious or anything like that anyway with herbs. So if you had to go have to get them to get that, then you could just simply tell them what it was you needed. So in other words, I guess my point to all of this is that there's nothing wrong with labeling your bottles in whatever way works for you, in my opinion, in your own herbal first aid kit. And then you just use it accordingly. Back to back to the herbal first aid kit, or the first aid kit part, the trauma kit and all of that. The type of tape that I like to use is the athletic tape. Now it's not ideal necessarily for bandaging, but it does work, and it works fine. And it's of course it pulls hair pretty bad when you pull it off and stuff, but the thing about it is, it's fairly versatile in a number of different things, and I find that in a first aid kit, you oftentimes need to be able to do sports wraps. So you really need to be able to do a real ankle wrap, right? Like a basket weave, heel lock type of ankle wrap, where you can have somebody with even a second degree or even a third degree sprain, where they can actually put enough weight onto it to be able to hopefully walk out with their own strength, as opposed to you having to carry somebody out, which if you've ever had to do that, you know how much energy that takes and how many people that will take to do something like that. So at all costs, you want to try to keep people ambulatory. And to do that, it helps to have know your sports wraps, and to be able to do that, you need sports tape. So you can't just take an ace wrap and wrap it around somebody's ankle. It's not going to do anything at all. So that's what I use athletic tape for, as well as holding bandages on, as well as all the things that you use athletic tape for in a medical environment. I find it's a much better, more versatile type tape. Then I have different types of gauze: 3x3s, 4x4s, 2x2s, ace wraps. Ace wraps are very, very useful for stopping bleeding. They're a compression, and they're also useful as a compression on an injury, of course, to help keep the inflammation down. But the ace wrap itself I'm kind of old school about that. I just, gauzes and anything to basically help the blood, catch the blood, help the blood clot, and then, of course, wrap an ace wrap around it, and you've got immediate good compression on a wound that stops even pretty tough. Any kind of a wound that's going to need anything less than a tourniquet, you can work with an ace wrap, and you can do that. Plus, with the ace wrap, the nice thing is, of course, you can wash it, you can sterilize, you can boil it, and and basically when you're done, you can reuse it. And that stretchy kind of self-adhesive wraps that you can buy, those are pretty much one-time use. Some of them say they aren't, that you can use them multiple times, but they aren't. Once you've used them once or twice, they're done. So that's why I prefer ace wraps. Cravat is a triangular bandage, and we give 3 in this as a base, but you really need more like 5 or 6 of them. You really can never use too many of those cravats. Wound wash of some sort I think is important to have, even though it's hauling liquid around in there that's kind of more weight. At the same time, if you don't have clean irrigation type wash for a laceration or a cut or something, then you're going to want that wound wash in there. I also have a syringe or 2 in there, so that you can, of course, just pull out drinking water if you need to wash something out. Band-aids are actually very useful. Don't think that just because they're a small thing, they're not important. Band-aids are extremely useful, especially in the field or in a post-disaster environment, to just keep something clean. A tiny cut can become infected very quickly in a post-disaster environment. A hurricane where there's all just seaweed seawater and sewage everywhere. Anything that you cut yourself on is immediately infected if you're not careful. And if you don't clean that out, and if you don't put something on top of it, it will become infected. And then, of course, just hand and alcohol wipes. That's probably fairly self-explanatory. It's good to have fine point tweezers. I like to have Ziplocs, not just regular Ziplocs, but you can use those. But actually, I buy a thicker mill type of plastic for those that are better. They're more durable, and they're better waterproof. And I'd like the type that you have a slide opening to them, not the kind that with grooves that fit into each other, because the grooves, once you get some blood and dirt and stuff like that on there, they don't really work very well, whereas the slide opening works pretty well. Bandage scissors, you need a good pair of bandage scissors, and 7-inch I think is about enough to get enough leverage to even cut through tough clothing like jeans and such. If you have to, somebody has a really bad cut on their leg or something, and you need to cut the pants away. You're not gonna be able to take the pants down over it, especially if there was maybe a penetrating object or something like that. You've got to be able to cut. Bandage scissors are very important and need to be part of anybody's first aid kit. Scalpels, I like scalpels because of the fact that they are a way to be able to get just very minor surgery, and I'm talking like splinters and that type of thing that you can't necessarily get with tweezers, or even with maybe even get out with a needle. Scalpels work really well. I remember working on a guy, actually this was also in Nicaragua a couple years ago, a surfer who had hit the coral reef pretty bad and was just, he's just had that stuff embedded in him, and the needle didn't work really well, but the scalpel, a good 11 scalpel with a point, it's got a nice pointy end on it, made it real easy to be able to pull that stuff out, all that coral out of him. Hemostats, very important for stopping bleeding too, an arterial bleed. That may be the only way you can really do it, possibly, and just being able to get in and look at something possibly. 18 gauge needle, I like that to be able to, sort of the same reason that you would use tweezers, just be able to get into things that the tweezers can't get into sometimes. The syringe for irrigation I talked about, and then I've got charcoal here. So charcoal is very useful. I've always used it as an adsorbent for people who are poisoned, and of course, if you eat something that's poisoned, or even food poisoning, to take that and then of course positioning your body in the right way to let gravity work for you. In other words, on your left side, so that your stomach is working uphill, to slow down your digestion and let that charcoal do its job. You can really take care of poisoning very easily that way. Charcoal poultices are also very useful. Definitely give a shout out to Seven Song. He uses them a lot, and I never really even considered using them externally like that until I saw some of his pictures and stuff he's done up at the rainbow gatherings and staff infections, and I was really impressed, very impressed. So it's really nice to be able to take something like that you can just pull that infection out with. And since looking at that and seeing what he's done, I did it with brown recluse bite and was very, very impressed with it. What I've used a lot here in the Southwest, what we use a lot is the prickly pear cactus, the Opuntia species, and that has a very good drawing quality to it as well. Also, mullein leaves do very good drawing quality to them, and I've used that before for brown recluse bites as well, very effectively. But I have to say the charcoal worked every bit as good as that, maybe even a little bit better. So I'm definitely sold on the idea of charcoal poultices for being able to draw stuff out. And you can use it, again, poultices are something you don't just put a poultice on and forget about it. You put a poultice on and you have to really keep track on it. You got to change them out. And so you could use the charcoal poultice to be able to pull infection out, and then you can use antimicrobial type, like the wound powder, something that's got something like chaparral and myrrh in it, to be able to help the tissue rebuild and help the tissue fight that infection as well. So you can bounce between different types of poultices and then let it dry out a little bit and make sure that the tissue state doesn't get too boggy or too wet, and it doesn't get too dry either. That's very important for wound healing. So there's a lot we can do with just what we've got right here. But again, this is a base herbal first aid kit that you'd want to add to as you needed it. So as you use this kit, as you use the herbs in this kit, you will find that the list of herbs that you want to have in there is probably going to grow significantly, and even for just a first aid kit, much less for something where you needed to supply the medical needs of a small group of people or a small community, almost in a clinic type setting. In which case, you would have dozens and dozens of different herbs and simples and formulas. Now, the thing with using just simples, I'll finish off by saying, if you're just using simples, and a simple is just a single herb, then the problem is you're going to have to mix it up, which in that case, if you think you're going to need to do that, and you should take this anyway, you should have the little measurement devices. The cheapo ones you can get at the drugstore, like I have in the picture here, are great for that, to just be able to measure and move formula, move tincture from one bottle to another, or whatever. As you mix a formula up, you're going to need some empty bottles if you do that. And then the thing to keep in mind is you're going to be taking a lot more tinctures. You're going to be taking, so it's more weight, it's more actual medicine, which is good if you need more. But it's more work in the field, and sometimes, if you're working in a dirty environment or post-disaster environment or whatever, what's going to happen is that's going to just you got more chance for your tincture to get dirty and the bottle to get dirty and all that kind of stuff. So it's really better, in my opinion, for just a first aid kit like this to have really to work more with formulas. But then if you're doing something with a clinic, of course, it's much better to work with simples. So just you got to kind of balance those worlds out a little bit as well. I think that's about all I have to say, and this ended up being probably a pretty long video. I hope this was useful for you. I'm leaving a link up here if you're interested in purchasing one of our Herbal First Aid Kits. We sell them, we mail them off. You can buy just the herbal components, or you can buy the full kit, or you can buy just the trauma kit and the non-herbal components as well. It is very cheap. If you added up all of the herbal components alone, and just the price that I sell them for, and that's not even close. I'm way under retail when I sell my tinctures, and if you added up all of those, it would be well over $200. Like $250, since that's the price of the full kit. If you talked about actual retail prices of some of these, assuming that you could even get them, good luck getting some of these formulas in a health food store or somewhere. You're not going to find them anywhere. And these are good formulas. I stand behind them. They're really good formulas, and they're experience based. In first aid type situations, and so if you were to try to find them, you would be talking more like about $320 for just the herb component alone. That's not even counting all of the trauma kit, the pack itself, and all that other stuff. So the price, I feel like is about what I don't like. Trying to sell things like, say, well, this is much cheaper than this or this or this. This isn't an infomercial, but at the same time, just so you know my philosophy is to try to find sort of that point of where I think people that are interested in herbology and interested in taking my classes at the Human Path, our classes there, this is kind of the upper level of the comfort zone of what they're able to spend, and I want it to be affordable for people as much as possible. So I picked a number and said, okay, what can I give you for $250? And I tried to pack as much in there as I possibly could. And so I hope this is something that you've learned from this video. And if you're interested in a Herbal First Aid Kit, feel free to click the link and either get one or just email me if you have any other questions about any of that, and I'll happy to respond. And thanks for checking this video out, and we'll talk to you next time around. Bye.